So I actually want to start with a few introductory points. I've been having a fun time being on Notre Dame campus. This is my first time here, and I'm realizing why. I have a good friend who did his MBA here, but also I was having this memory of this high school football coach that I had. I'm from Montana, and we had a coach who's Philadelphia Irish who had moved to Montana because he loves fly fishing, and so totally changed his life just so he could fly fish a lot. And I was realizing why I have this more visceral affinity for Notre Dame is because I spent every day at practice looking at the Fighting Irish logo that was tattooed on his calf. And so I have this very fond memory, and I was just realizing how jealous he would have been knowing that I was up in the press box last night. So I need to reconnect with him and send him a picture. Okay, a few other introductory things. Eva and I use a term in this. So all of this actually comes from a shared paper that we worked on with Patricia Bromley from the University of Utah and Curtis Child, also from BYU. We use this term social endeavor. We're trying to pick a term that would be very expansive. And so when we say social endeavor, we mean everything from like checkbook, corporate social responsibility, all the way over to really cutting edge social entrepreneurs that are doing something nobody's ever tried before. And so we're intentionally using a very expansive term here because of the nature of what we're talking about. I'm going to share a couple stories from one of the things I get to do, which is really fun at BYU, is advise our Social Venture Academy in competition. So it's essentially an incubator and competition for student social entrepreneurs. And so I'll share a couple stories that relate or exemplify what we're going to talk about. And then finally, just to make sure you don't have any misconceptions about me, I'm not an academic, actually. I'm a teaching faculty member, originally an attorney, also with an MPA, and just very luckily fell into teaching and love it to death. Ava's the real deal, so you can ask her the hard questions if that's all right with you guys. Okay. So we're talking about risk. This paper came from an idea that Eva had to write a paper in a week, and a theory paper, obviously. But so we got together with Tricia and Curtis last year, a little over a year ago, and sat down. Well, the one paper never quite got finished, although we got a lot of work done that 1 week, and now it's turning into 3 papers. But anyway, all that kind of comes from this experience we had. And one of it started because the Ballard Center for Social Innovation in our college essentially sponsored us for the week to try to come up with some good thinking about social entrepreneurship. And if you know the field of social entrepreneurship, you know there's a real fight over what the definition of social entrepreneurship actually is. And it seems like every other issue, there's an article in Stanford Social Innovation Review saying, no, social entrepreneurship means this. And then people argue about it for a little while, and then another definition shows up not too long later. We started off with a definitional approach and realized we weren't going to get anywhere either. And then we started having a really interesting conversation about risk that sort of opened our minds a little bit to thinking about these things differently. The reason it fits here is because of this very simple equation. This is how you calculate risk. Risk is fundamentally probability times outcome. Our conversation here has been entirely about outcomes. Very little about probability, although probability is implied in everything we've discussed already. But we'll get to that more later. It's also worth noting that outcomes actually together constitute both gains and losses. Social impact measurement doesn't often incorporate loss or failure. It usually is only contemplating gains. And that also gives an incomplete perspective. Eva's going to discuss that sort of ignorance of loss, that not paying attention to losses side in much more detail. She came up with this really creative approach to try to measure perspective, attitudes toward loss or sensitivity to loss when it comes to social endeavors. But you know, outcomes, they're hard to measure for all the reasons we've all talked about. I wanted to show an example of, this is probably the most successful group to come out of our Social Venture Academy, a group called Eco Scraps. What they do is they collect food waste from grocery stores, produce essentially that would get thrown away because it's rotting, and they compost it and then sell it to compost. So it's a pretty cool business model because they get paid to take the waste away from the grocery stores, and then they compost it through their rapid process, and then people buy the compost from them. So they're getting paid on both ends of their supply chain, which if you can figure out a business where that works, then definitely get into that business. One of the things I love about EcoScraps is they've been very measurement focused from the beginning. They started measuring the weight of what they processed from the very, very beginning, back when they were doing it in a backyard. And so I took this, they update their little dashboard on their website. So to date, they've recycled 15 million pounds of food waste, which results in a methane reduction of 9 million pounds of methane, which is the equivalent of parking 844,000 cars for 2 weeks in terms of reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And right now they're collecting from 96 different outlets in 4 states and continuing to grow. Doesn't this make you want to buy their stuff? Like you want to fertilize your garden with their product, right? It's really great measurement, but I want to make a point about the way we think about measurement. I mean, here's an example of it being great, easy for them, right? I mean, it's a lot easier to measure pounds of things than it is to measure, all the other less measurable things we've talked about. But if you love what they do, it's not just for what they've done, but you love the thought of what they're going to do. You love thinking about this organization growing and accomplishing more and becoming bigger and having a greater impact. And it kind of makes the point that social impact measurement is retrospective. I really appreciated Cecilia's summary of that because it showed how, it's either ongoing or retrospective, but you'll notice it's not prospective because, you can't measure things that haven't happened yet. You're just guessing at the things that haven't happened yet. But the reality is that social impact measurement only matters prospectively, right? If you're an economist, you understand the concept of sunk costs. You're supposed to ignore sunk costs. The money is spent, it's gone, you're not getting it back. Obviously you learn from your sunk costs, but you're supposed to ignore them in the decisions you make. Social impact measurement is only important going forward because the reason we do it is so that it shapes our future decisions. And as long as the future is involved, as long as the future is included, then probability shows up. Risk shows up, which Rajiv talked about with us yesterday in great eloquence, and so when you have the future involved and probable outcomes rather than certain outcomes from the past, things get quite a bit messier. In fact, if you want to be especially assertive about this idea, social impact measurement only gives us half of the equation, right? It only gives us the outcome part of risk. It doesn't give us the probability side of risk. And measuring outcomes is hard for all the reasons we talked about. Predicting outcomes is heroic, right? It's that much harder because you're including probability in the equation, and probability is messy, and probability, well, by definition, it's uncertain. And all of our efforts to be certain about what might happen in the future, we still aren't very good at doing it reliably. So, I wouldn't be so presumptuous as to say that someday we'll be talking about social risk measurement rather than social impact measurement, but fundamentally that's the way we really are thinking about it anyway, even if not deliberately, because essentially all this outcome stuff that we're measuring only matters prospectively. I'll give you another example from our really amazing students. This is a company called Tilapiana. An MBA student had this really creative idea to do micro-franchise fish farming in Ghana. His idea was to essentially dig ponds on people's property and teach them aquaculture so they could grow tilapia fish, which is really overfished in Ghana. There are actually only 3 commercial fisheries for tilapia in the whole country, and so a lot of the wild capture has been overfished in the different rivers and lakes and whatnot, and so it's actually in pretty high demand. And just an example of predicting of how hard the probability part is. Justin, the student who did this, was meticulous in his research and ended up getting some field-leading aquaculturists to advise him in the environment, and he got money to go over and do a pilot. This is a picture of the first set of ponds that they dug and set up. And a year later, when harvest time came, the fish were only half as big as they were supposed to be. And this is with experts in the field telling him how to feed these fish. And the fish were only half as big as they were supposed to be, which was a huge disappointment because, you know, if a fish is half the size, you're going to get at best half the money for it. And so his financial model was kind of turned upside down, and now he's considering a commercial scale approach instead of this micro franchise approach, which would have been really cool, but turns out it's not going to work. So there are a lot of problems with us predicting the future, and risk is hard for us to grasp. Expected utility sort of incorporates risk in a rigorous sort of rational approach. The essential takeaways from expected utility theory are, first of all, that we have an accurate perception of our utility preferences, of our utility functions, the things we prefer. It also predicts that we have an accurate perception of, it doesn't predict, it assumes that we have an accurate perception of probability, which also is not true. And so the total sum of these outcomes, right, the outcome times the probability tells us the choice we should make, right? Because for each choice there's a potential set of outcomes times the probabilities, and we pick the one that produces the highest expected utility. That's the rational approach to this, but I hope all of you kind of see how unrealistic that is in decision making. I mean, we don't understand our utility functions perfectly, we don't predict outcomes perfectly, and to the extent those two are true, we're not really, I mean, we can't choose the highest and best outcome every time. Kahneman and Tversky, the founders of behavioral economics, in their groundbreaking prospect theory paper, rather than sort of making all these assumptions and describing the rational way to make decisions involving risk, they actually went and measured the way people perceive risk, and they came up with some really interesting observations. First, they found that human beings are more averse to loss. We hate losses more than we like gains. So the feeling you get of losing $100 is worse than the happiness you get from getting $100. We really hate loss. In fact, we like to talk about ourselves as risk averse, and that's not technically true. We're actually loss averse, and we engage in risk-seeking behavior to avoid losses, like buying insurance. I mean, or like if anybody here's ever bought an extended warranty, you overpaid. By definition, you overpay because that's how they stay in business. If you didn't overpay for the extended warranty, they wouldn't make money off of these things. And so that's one of the observations from Kahneman and Tversky, is that we're loss averse. Okay, and that's important when we're talking about risk in the context of social endeavors, because we really hate loss and we're scared off by loss, and it's very distasteful to us. And so as a result, we become very conservative about potential programs because the thought of loss scares us. Another interesting observation is that small probabilities tend to be overweighted and large ones are underweighted. A way to illustrate this is what they found is that, you know, if I tell you, well, there's a 2% chance, or no, what if I put it, I don't want to be too morbid about it. Let's pretend that, you know, I told you there's a 2% chance tomorrow you're going to lose $1,000. Our brains obsess about that 2% chance, even though there's a 98% chance it's not going to happen. That little tiny gap, that 2%, doesn't feel so certain anymore, even though it's pretty remote probability. We obsess about the sort of the margins when it comes to probability distributions. Another interesting thing is that small values tend to be overvalued and large values tend to be undervalued, so we have a diminishing sensitivity to gains and losses. This is why our representatives in Congress can make budgetary decisions involving billions of dollars, talking about it like it's no big deal. We think in relative terms rather than absolute terms, and so, you know, what's another $100 billion, right? When you're talking about a budget at the federal level. But here's the thing, right, to all of you, especially those of you running programs that might involve federal money, you take that $100 million, wouldn't you? I mean, if it's no big deal to them, right? They seem to not care too much about it, so why not give it to one of you, right? I mean, it shows how we're desensitized to large numbers, and that's another observation from prospect. You see immediately why this was a groundbreaking paper. And then finally, an interesting thing about human beings is we don't consider value relative to an absolute zero, rather we consider it to our set point. So wherever we are in the current moment is what determines gains or losses to us. So it's not so much, well, at least I have some money. That's not how we think about it. We only think of it relative to our current position in terms of gains or losses. So the reason I bring this all up is because, this shows you how messy it is understanding risk. I mean, we're really bad at understanding probabilities for the reasons demonstrated here, and we're bad at understanding our utility functions. Economists assume that a rational set of preferences for economists are reflexive, transitive, and complete. Turns out none of those three are true in the way we think about our preferences. And so, in fact, I was asking Emily after a presentation, how they do this in the British SRI approach. How do they get the stakeholders to approximate measures of value? And I mean, it sounds like it's not terribly precise and really open to influence. Oh, I didn't put that up. Really open to influence in all kinds of directions. Usually, you ask people to substitute, and that's how you can kind of get economic value. But if you ask them to substitute, the example we gave is, how much time would you spend, or how much money would you spend being willing to go to a local pool? Well, if you ask, if they go to the swimming pool versus a public park, it might actually change substantially the way people think about that. So, anyway, kind of getting more to the point of why we think a risk perspective is maybe a better way to think about this, why probability should be included in the way we approach social endeavors, is because it does these three things for us. One, it acknowledges loss, which is really important. Two, it can organize us in different ways. And then three, risk can be allocated, which from an attorney's perspective is really exciting. So let me talk about acknowledging loss quickly. Jim Furchterman is kind of a social entrepreneur extraordinaire. He's done a bunch of really cool stuff in appropriate technology from the Bay Area. He also advises a lot of social entrepreneurs. He had this really interesting post on Social Edge. He said, like most social entrepreneurs, I noticed that people react to incentives. So behavior, like risk aversion, stems from experience. And social sector leaders have learned that for the most part, telling a relentlessly positive story about every project pays off. And talking about failure leads to raising less money. And so the result is because we're so sometimes deliberately, sometimes unintentionally ignorant of loss and failure, we avoid it, and it's a problem because we fail to learn quite a bit that we could learn. It's interesting on the business side, loss and failure is treated much more understandably. Like, people are much more understanding and accommodating of loss on the failure on the for-profit side. I mean, of course, nobody loves it, but it kind of happens to everybody in the business world. But we don't like talking about it that way in the nonprofit sector for some reason. To give you an example of this, there's over 100 years of data on business failures for academics to turn to understand why businesses fail. And the data that are available for nonprofit failures and it's pathetic, actually. It's tiny. In fact, for most nonprofits, we don't even know when they fail or how, because they just sort of disappear. They fade away, right? They don't tell anybody that they're done, right? If they're on the verge of failure, a lot of people aren't going to notice that they're done anyway. And so we don't know. It's not just that we don't know with certainty why nonprofits fail. We still don't even know for sure how many fail. And that's kind of crazy when you think about it, isn't it? We still don't even know for sure how many of these organizations are failing, let alone why. And I think it has to do with this sort of aversion to loss that affects the way we think about it. But if risk becomes more embedded, if thinking about it as social risk becomes more embedded in the way we operate, hopefully we can talk about this more openly. All right, second thing. Thinking about risk has an organizing effect. This was actually one of the aha and exciting moments for me during that paper in a week process. Because one of the reasons you want to come up with a definition for social entrepreneurship is so you can start categorizing, right? Academics love to put people in buckets. Like, we love categorizing things. And what's interesting is that it's still really hard to categorize right now. I mean, there's people with good ideas, but it's hard to do. Risk is actually a really fascinating categorizing method. As a lawyer, my inclination is to think about it in legal distinctions, right? You've got like private foundations, which are legally distinct from public charities. Collectively, they're 501c3s, which are legally distinct from C4s, which are, legally distinct from for-profit ventures like C corps or S corps or LLCs, right? And then we've got new legal categories like the L3C status and benefit corp status and those sorts of things. And we've got all these legal distinctions, but the reality is within those categories, you get a lot of different stuff going on. I think in the finance world, they figured this out. Obviously there's still a lot of innovation going on, but there's a lot of categorization that's already taken place. They've categorized all these different types of financial risk. They've also organized instruments around these different kinds of risk, right? And so, and you can, and as an investor, you can sort of evaluate, okay, what's my risk profile? And once I know that, then I know how to invest. Right? And even, pretty much every financial advisor does this with their client. They say, well, what do you want to happen in the future? And that will help us determine what investments you should be interested in, right? And so you might invest in safe bonds. You might, get really exciting and go crazy into futures and stuff like that. But the point is you have options available to you depending on what your risk preferences are. We don't think about it that way in the nonprofit world, especially for funders. Funders don't have these sort of pre-made, established, well-thought-out categories of quote-unquote investment or funding based on risk profiles. I think a lot don't even deliberately think about their risk profile. But we all do that as investors. I think it makes sense for funders in the nonprofit space to do that as well. There's an important little aside to make here. Another thing that's true, a true analogy from the finance world that carries over into social impact is this idea of financial gravity. If you want to have a chance for just small losses, then in exchange for that, you're only going to get small gains, right? There's this, if you're only willing to bear small losses, then you're only going to get small gains out of your investment. But if you're willing to bear big losses, then you have a shot at big gains, right? And this is the difference between those of us who buy treasury bonds versus venture capitalists who sink a bunch of money into a bunch of corporations that, like the guys who invested in Facebook did pretty well, but they had, 12 times as many failures as they had successes. But they were okay with that, right? I think this is true in the social space as well. I think the bigger the gains we want, the more we have to recognize there are big losses that could potentially result from what we do. And so anyway, just that observation about financial gravity. So how can risk organize the way we think about things? Well, here are two foundations we worked with at BYU, clients of a program we call Grantwell, where students advise large donors. And these are pretty equivalent. Their budgets are different. The Peary Foundation from the Bay Area has about 45 million in assets, whereas the Sorensen Legacy Foundation has about 750 million in assets. But they have a pretty similar organizational structure. They both have very small staffs. And they do a lot of family-driven giving. The boards are entirely made up of family members for both organizations. So legally, we put them in the same bucket, right? We think about them as the same kind of entity. But the reality is, if you look at their risk profiles, they're completely different. The Peary Foundation is very interested in cutting-edge stuff. They filled gaps. They filled a funding gap of around $100,000 or so when a lot of organizations have tested a concept and now need help starting to scale. They funded really innovative, creative stuff that most foundations are afraid of. They're also a very open, accessible foundation in the way they approach funding. Sorensen Legacy Foundation is more of a typical family foundation. They fund a lot of pet projects. They primarily fund things like education and arts. The stuff that they fund with big money is almost all education and arts. They very rarely will fund, innovative things, and they have a much more conservative risk profile. We would put them in different buckets if we're thinking about risk, even though in every other way we put them in the same one as far as organizing. So I think the perspective of risk has this really cool ability to sort of organize the sector for us in ways we haven't thought about. And then finally, my last point is that risk allocation is a fundamental principle of contract law. Every good lawyer knows that one of the most important things you do in any contract is when you're drafting a contract, you need to think of all the potential risks and you assign them to the parties who appropriately should bear the risk. And that's one of the main goals of any contract, is to make sure the risk has been allocated to the appropriate parties. There's not a lot of deliberate risk allocation in the nonprofit sector. When we undertake endeavors, we don't stop and think, okay, what are all the risks and who's going to pay the price if this risk manifests itself? We don't think about it in that deliberate way, but in the business world they do all the time. That's what attorneys are hired to do, is to allocate risk. And I think social endeavors often ignore and misallocate risks because of these reasons. Well, I obviously didn't finish that thought. Anyway, and it brings us back to the financial gravity thing, right? I mean, the loftier your goals, the more dangerous you become, and you got to think more deliberately about risk allocation in that process. So I'm going to hand the time over to Eva now, because although we have this simple equation of risk being probability times outcome, it sort of begs the question, what kind of outcomes are we talking about?
So one of the first things I want to talk about is that there are really three different kinds of assets that we can expect returns on when we engage in a social endeavor. And again, social endeavors can be something that's done by government, by nonprofit, by social entrepreneurs, by corporations, whatever. And the fact that there are three different categories of assets where we can expect returns also means that there are three categories of assets that we're risking when we engage in social endeavors. So these three types of assets are operational capital, and by this I mean not just money, but I mean anything that can be easily monetized. We've talked a lot about monetizing things during the past couple of days, and there are some things that lend themselves to being monetized very easily and other things that are a little more difficult. So we include in operational assets things like human capital, volunteer hours, any of that kind of stuff. That you can actually find a reasonable correlate in a dollar figure. But there are two other kinds of assets that we don't think about as much in terms of monetizing because they're very, very hard to monetize. One of those is affective capital. And by this we mean a lot of the emotional kind of stuff that comes with the good that we do. So you might think about things like warm glow, which is a big thing we talk about when we talk about recruiting donors, right? We want to make sure that they're getting enough warm glow, so we tell them about all the good they're doing, because then they're more likely to donate back to us again. So that's actually an asset that we have, is that warm glow, that good feeling. I've heard people talk about the benefits that their clients are receiving emotionally or in their families. All of that may be affective type of capital. It's very difficult to monetize, but it is an asset, and we can gain it by doing social endeavors. We also risk it when we engage in social endeavors. If you look at corporate social responsibility or social entrepreneurship, you're going to hear about things like reputation and trust. Clients like to shop at places that have good reputations and where they have a good trust. So not just in the social sector do we see these affective capital assets, we also see it in markets. The third type of asset is public value, and I think that's most of what we've been sort of talking about here, social impact in terms of public value. And again, we mean, just like many of you have talked about previously, when we talk about public value, we're talking about some kind of change in benefits to society. So these may be good changes, they may be bad changes, right? But this is an asset that we invest. Now, one thing that may be weird to think about is, well, how do you invest affective capital? How do you invest public value? And so we've put together a model that goes through 3+ a few phases for how we can think about all three of these asset types in terms of investment and return. So phase 1 is the initial investment. This is where we say, all right, what are all of our operational capital assets? What's the money we have? What's the volunteer capital we have? What are our human resources? Do we have buildings? Do we have potential donors? What are our operational capital assets? And then we also think about our affective capital assets. Well, who likes us? Who trusts us? Who might our stakeholders be? Who can we make feel good about the work that we do? And during this initial investment phase, there's actually some interaction between those two things. You think about a capital campaign where you want to build a building, and what an organization may do is actually cash in on some of their affective capital and go out and find people that they can sell warm fuzzies to, and then gain financial operational capital so that they can invest in the organization that they want to do. So some of that makes a little bit more sense. We're kind of used to thinking about transferring between those two things and possibly investing them in some kind of social endeavor that we're about to engage in. But the third thing that we also invest is our public value status quo. If we want to change the level of public value, that means that we are starting at some level of status quo. And if we're going to go messing around with public value, we may cause harm, not just good. And so the way we conceive of this is that we invest the public value status quo whenever we engage in a social endeavor, and that we are using that as an asset that we may either produce gains with or we may incur losses with. So the second phase is the public value change. This is where we take our operational capital and we take our affective capital and we do something. We do something that ideally creates a positive change in public value. Now, it may be that we affect no change whatsoever, in which case we have just incurred significant losses in both our operational capital and our affective capital, right? Not awesome. But ideally, we do something good, and it's also possible that we do something bad. So each of you has this book in front of you, and I had not seen this book before, and so I flipped through, I was looking at the chapters, and there was a chapter that said something like, first do no harm, then go do more good, right? So I flipped to page 95, where this happens to be, and there's a little story about an organization that started a program with the intent of decreasing domestic violence and improving outcomes in those areas. And luckily they were doing some outcome measurement, and it turns out that the training that they were offering people actually made things worse on every single one of their key indicators. So this is what we're talking about, where there is potential for not just gains in public value, but losses. So what did they invest? They invested whatever level of public value their trainees were at. And then they could have made it better, or they could have made it worse, or there could have been no change. So this is that second phase, public value change. The third phase is where we start to see returns on that investment. And this is where some of the ideas, especially on the market side with social entrepreneurship, this is where people are really focusing. If you look at any of the literature on corporate social responsibility, they're not interested in making the world a better place, right? I mean, social entrepreneurship, yes, but corporate social responsibility, not as much. What they're interested in is basically greenwashing kind of effects, right? They want to be able to convert public value into affective capital that they then cash in on in terms of profits and loyalty from their customers. That's really what it's about. And if you look at people who research corporate social responsibility in the management journals, that is what they're talking about. They're talking about how do we do good in a cheap way that allows us to maximize our profits. So that's something that they're thinking a lot about. Well, we can think about that too, and we do. We think about, well, if I do more good, then that creates more public value, which is our primary aim, but that happened in phase 2. Now we're going to take that public value, whatever we've done, and much of this conference has been about how do we take that value and convert it back into affective capital, where people now like what we do and want to donate to us, so we can start to convert again between operational capital and affective capital. So by doing this, by seeing these returns on investment in affective capital and operational capital, we sort of flip back to the beginning, and sometimes there are recurring effects, secondary effects that happen because of this. So during that public value change, we have caused some kind of change in public value, sometimes intended, sometimes not intended, and that can actually reverberate through this process and either magnify our ability to do good or drastically diminish it as we then re-impact the amount of operational and affective capital that we have. So this whole idea of investment and return suggests correctly not only that we can do good, but also that we can do harm, that we can incur significant losses, and that this can happen even in public value, not just in money, not just in reputation, but even in the social impact that we actually have. So we can actually incur losses in that. So if we agree with this idea, right? If this is a potential problem, or at least something that we need to be thinking about, one of the other things that we need to be aware of is the fact that we don't do a good job of thinking about risk. we're really bad at it. Even those of us who are really good at it and practiced at it are really bad at it. And we're bad at it in very specific and predictable ways, some of which Erin talked about before. But we need to be really aware of these cognitive biases before we go into this. And one of the things is we were sitting locked in our room in the Marriott School with our magically replenishing bottle of chocolates that the Ballard Center provided to us. We were thinking about, well, how might these cognitive biases impact the way that we engage in social endeavors? And as we thought about it, it occurred to us that we were not hearing these stories about losses, right? We weren't hearing about that. And so we started to think about, well, what should we be doing in terms of risk? How should we be thinking about this? And how do we think we actually do think about it? And so we came up with two models, and these are intended to be very, very impressive. So I hope you are sufficiently impressed. We came up with two utility models. And you'll notice these are not financial models. These are not predictions of financial value. These are predictions of utility. So the idea that there is value beyond the dollar is definitely included and incorporated here. And so the first formula is basically what we think people actually do when they think about these three kinds of assets and how we invest them. And all of that stuff in that first equation basically says that we believe that people think about the public value gains that they will get, the affective capital gains that they will get, and that they think about financial gains and potential losses. So we expect that people do a pretty good job of thinking about how much is this thing going to cost me, right? But not so much how much is this going to cost me in affective capital and how much is it going to cost potentially in public value. So we think it would be better if we thought about the potential losses in addition to potential gains in all of those areas, which is what that second equation says. We just added a couple of little terms for thinking about potential losses in public value and in affective capital. So that brings up, though, kind of an empirical point. Is this really how people think about things? Is this accurate, or are we just completely misrepresenting the world? And I will be honest that one of the first places we started to think about was the corporate world, because I believe personally that in the nonprofit world we've seen losses, and we may not talk about them a lot. We're not super proud of times that we've made people's lives worse instead of better, but we absolutely learn from those, right? And on the government side, there are a lot of sort of hoops to jump to in order to protect the public interest. And so you've got a lot of barriers and protections. But if you think about the way markets work, you go out and you do something, and the way you figure out whether or not it works is whether you gain profit or not, right? Well, so the only thing that you're really thinking about losing is money. And so if you're willing to lose the money, that's fine. But if you're engaged in corporate social responsibility or social entrepreneurship, there's a whole lot more on the line than just how much money did I sink into this project. And so one of the places that we think that people were less effective at thinking about this was in that sort of corporate world. And so that's where we decided to test this idea that maybe we are significantly underestimating our affective capital and public value losses. So we did a little tiny pilot study. We ran it through IRB very, very quickly, gathered data, just a super convenient sample, just to see if there was even anything there, if we were on the right track, because we were not going to invest in finishing this whole project out if we were on the wrong track. So the purpose here really is just to look at potential distortions in the way we assess risk. And so we have 4 scenarios, and we vary them on 2 key characteristics. One is the nature of the social engagement, and the second is the amount of money invested. We go from $100 to $1 million in multiples of 10. And we demonetize everything. So we've talked a lot about monetizing things during the past couple of days. I actually think that that's a less effective way to think about public value, because there are so many things that are hard to monetize. And I'm concerned that we're going to recreate market failure by only valuing things that can be monetized, which is the failure to do that is the whole reason that we're the third sector in the first place. So instead of monetizing affective capital, reputation, or public value, we actually demonetize things like financial returns. So the basic setup is this. There's a little test question to help make sure everybody's doing the procedure correctly, and then they launch into this little scenario. So you're the CEO of a multi-million-dollar oil company. Your organization has decided to engage in a CSR activity to offset the harm that your company may be causing and to be a good citizen. So you're going to identify for us the likely best possible outcome for this engagement, the likely worst possible outcome for this engagement, and what you believe to be the most likely actual outcome of this engagement. And we're going to look at 3 areas: impact on society, impact on your company's finances, and impact on your company's reputation. We tried to pick things that were pretty intuitive, that fell into each of our 3 asset categories, but were intuitive to people so we wouldn't have to explain a whole lot about what we meant. The 4 scenarios are these. We have, first, you donate money to local charities, where you have your biggest oil refinery, right? The second one is that you invest in another company that produces a new form of clean alternative energy. The third is that you provide jobs to people who've been recently released from prison and are having a hard time finding work. And the fourth is that you purchase an experimental new technology. Now, we intentionally chose things that should be associated with some level of risk and some level of potential return, so that we could kind of look at some potential variation across the kinds of engagement that we do. And the way we have them indicate this is with these little sliders. So they identify the impact on finances, reputation, and society by moving this little slider. However far they move it, they can go from negative 100 to positive 100, and the number that they've selected shows up there on the right. And then we've also sort of labeled these with, okay, these are large gains and these are large losses, so they can kind of approximate, oh, I think that'll be large gains or small losses or whatever. And we very intentionally put the finances on top so that they would use that as a reference, right? So that we could actually compare directly across finances, reputation, and impact on society in this sort of qualitative, utility maximizing slider approach. We would love feedback on this, by the way, because this is the first time it's seen the light of day, and the more feedback, the better. All right. So these are the average scores across all scenarios. So we've taken all 4 scenarios and sort of squished them into these averages. And there are a couple things to notice. The first thing to notice is that if you look at the likely best outcome, we are not super hopeful on the financial side that we are going to be making a whole lot of money off of any of these endeavors. But look at our expectations for reputation and social outcomes, right? That falls into the moderate gains category in both cases. And you'll see how much larger those expectations are, how much higher those expectations are than financial. And this is when we're directly relating financial expectations to these other expectations. The next thing to look at is the likely worst outcome. We expect very large financial losses, but we don't think we're going to lose. I mean, it's potential that worst case scenario, we're going to lose a little bit of reputation and a little bit of public value, but we're not really expecting to lose a whole lot, even in our worst case scenario. And then finally, we have the most likely outcome, and you'll see that the most likely financial outcome is negative, and the most likely reputation and social outcomes are much more positive than that.
Who again answered these questions?
These are like former students. I mean, this is super convenient sample.
Oh, sure.
We're just trying to see if there's anything there. Now, lest you say that by averaging all 4 scenarios, we have whitewashed our data, here are the actual tables all broken out. You'll see that that pattern actually holds across all 4 scenarios. There is some variation by scenario, but by and large, we expect financial losses and we expect gains in reputation and social. So already we can see that even if we're looking at the worst case scenario and we're thinking about the worst case scenario, we are underestimating our losses and we are overestimating our gains. But beyond that, we have these little sliders and people are indicating their best and their worst, and they can see them on the same page, and they've been thinking about this sort of in order. And what we find is that the most likely outcome isn't just a simple average of what we think the most likely positive outcome and the most likely bad outcome are, but rather people are heavily weighting the positive outcome. So depending on whether you're looking at financial, affective, or public value, for every 1 unit increase in the best likely outcome, we're increasing by about half a unit in our most likely ultimate outcome, but the impact is about half that and sometimes a mere fraction of that for the impact of the worst likely outcome. So we are not thinking about the worst possible outcomes when we think about what's likely. So we view that as evidence that there is in fact the kind of distortion that we predicted, and we're going to have to collect more and better data, which is always fun. So the other thing I wanted to point out is that there's also a correlation between, we randomized the amount of money that was involved in the scenarios so that people were seeing different amounts of money, and we wanted to see if there was an effect of how much money people were investing in this on their expected value of social return. And it turns out that the more money that they were investing in this, the more they expected their social return to increase. So the idea here is that people, when they're thinking about this, are basically saying, well, if we want to have a bigger impact, let's just throw more money at it, right? And that there's that sort of positive correlation. So what does this all mean? Why do we care? How does it fit into the context of what we've been talking about in the past couple of days? Well, the first thing is that we need to think about the fact that we're investing more than just operational capital when we engage in social endeavors. We invest and also risk affective capital and public value as well. That means we have the potential to make things worse, not just better. And that if nothing else, failure to affect positive change, even if we're not actually actively causing harm, is a waste of resources. Because there's opportunity cost to consider. So if we're throwing a bunch of resources at something that doesn't work, we could have been throwing those resources at something that does. We think about intangible returns in cognitively distorted ways. And that is particularly important for this group of people to recognize, because we are the ones who are looking at social impact. We're the ones who are putting these values on things. And if we're not aware of our own cognitive biases as we're putting together our SROI or doing our program evaluation approaches, we are going to miss these things that we're risking. And that's really important. So we need to be careful about that, particularly when we're monetizing. Because even these super initial, very small and very convenient sample findings suggest that we are likely to overestimate the expected value of social endeavors, particularly in comparison with money. The way we think about expected social impact may affect what we look for and what we find, preventing us from seeing the truth about our work. We must be prepared to face our worst nightmare, that our efforts to do good in the world might also result in harm. Our best hope, in my opinion, is to improve our ability to assess risk before we engage in these social endeavors, and that includes not only looking at the operational capital that we're dealing with, but also the intangible assets and the public value that we're investing, involving looking at that status quo and deciding how much of that we're willing to risk when we do things. And I think that these are important things to include when we're looking at social impact prospectively. Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes for questions.
Rich Mansakowski. This presentation means a lot and is applicable to what we do as far as risk allocation. I work with international student exchange programs, so the social impact of our programs is very difficult to define because we bring in students, place them with host families, enroll them in public and private schools, there's homestay immersions, and they go back to their country. So to measure exactly what the social impact is very difficult, although there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of great things happening that we sometimes hear about. On the other side, though, public value, we are very well aware of the risk of bringing 2,000 teenagers, placing them with, host families, and things. We know that things usually go well when we have well-screened students with well-screened families. Good things happen. But two factors: society is getting more and more legalistic. You're dealing with minors who don't always have good judgment. Sometimes host families do not always have good judgment, so you need to protect yourself. So we spend a lot of our time monitoring the experience, making sure we're following up on flags and listening to the students. But two things, we've got attorneys involved, ready to pounce on a difficult situation. And although we may be doing, 98%, the kids, everybody's satisfied and good things will happen in the future, it doesn't take much for an experience to go wrong, and the attorneys, and now more so than ever, the media to get involved and put, the bad experience on the front page of the newspaper, or, you've got a reporter and trying to interview you. So I totally can relate with, the public value, so one measure of success our organization has is that things do not go bad, because when most families and students are satisfied, things will be good, and it's not always measurable, right, in the immediate, but in the future, but it's difficult to measure, years down the road.
Thanks for that comment. I just want to make a quick point based on that. Most nonprofits, when they think about risk management, they're thinking about what happens if we get sued. I mean, that's like universally, that's risk management, right? Is we might get sued. So let's have an insurance policy in place. Let's have, training in place. So if we get sued, it's okay. I mean, that's the way most nonprofits think about risk management. That is risk management in the nonprofit world. But it's good to be thinking about risks beyond potential lawsuits. You're not going to get sued for everything bad that might happen, right? And that's kind of the hope, is we can broaden that perspective on what risk actually means. So thanks for sharing the example. It's a great example.
Hi, thanks very much for that. I mean, I work in the operational risk management side of things more than the financial and financially influenced side that you guys are looking at, but it really ties in. And one of the things that I have found is that often the biggest risks are not the ones you've identified up front. Even if you've gone through a little bit of a process, if you haven't really gone through a rigorous risk assessment, you don't know what you're in for. And that is both in terms of negative risks and positive upside risks. Sometimes I work on the risk control side, so we've done a risk assessment, know what are you supposed to do about it, right? You try to design some kind of intervention. And some of the times the biggest positive impacts of the things that people come up with aren't tied to the risk of interest. They're tied to other things, and the positive side effects are huge. So I just wanted to bring up, because I know we have a pretty diverse audience here, that when you're doing this, you don't just want to look at those planned for social benefits. You also want to look at those found social benefits that Naomi and Jeff were talking about, and to go out and find those before you start, so that you know what you're working on. And to suggest that, as I said earlier, you should really listen to Sal, because I start with the root cause analysis, do that risk assessment up front to see what is this problem we're trying to solve, and then what are the risks for the solution.
I was wondering about, thank you for a great presentation, I really enjoyed it. I was wondering about solutions to this, to try and get in better estimations of risk. And I was wondering about something that both Saul and Roxanne talked about, which is turning to research and seeing about the probabilities of taking intervention. If you're thinking about that, or possibly other ways to address this problem.
So one of the challenges is that there are so many different fields that we're looking at. So the probabilities, the specific probabilities for any given program are going to be unique to that program, and that's a little tricky. We can go back and use some of the program evaluation that we've done and do retrospective probabilities and use them sort of going forward and adjust them as we go along, which is, I think, a good approach. But I think one of the bigger issues that's a little bit more general is this problem that we keep trying to monetize things. And if you buy market failure, if you buy that one of the whole reasons that there is a third sector and that there is a government is because there are some things that can't be monetized sufficiently, or the value can't be captured sufficiently to monetize them in a market, and that's why we even exist. If you buy that, then it becomes very, very dangerous to start focusing on things that we can monetize, because we're gonna lose lots of public value and lots of affective value in that way. So I think in terms of measurement, that is probably our next biggest challenge. And one of the surprises for me is that this concept's been around in economics for just ages, right? The idea of the UTIL, do you guys remember this from econ, right? I mean, that there is actually some concept that we're all talking about, and that's utility, and it just so happens that markets have been able to capture that and convert it into dollars or pounds or euros or whatever, monetary. So I think that's actually probably even more important and more immediately pressing than the issue of probability assignment, because we can guess at probabilities and we can look retrospectively, but I think the harder thing is to say, rather than looking at funders who are trying to pull us back into the market, and forcing us to monetize things, I think we need to push back and we need to say, no, we need to figure out some alternative way to value these things that doesn't involve the dollar or the euro or the pound. And so I think that's probably...
Going on with that and talking about the, how do you make predictions and what next? I think, like I said, we don't really have great data on failures in the nonprofit sector. Again, drawing on the finance example, if I want to invest in mid-cap tech stocks, I can go look at decades worth of information about them and see what trends have been for the industry, and I can estimate probabilities based on those trends. There's nothing like that in the nonprofit sector. I mean, Eva and I are working on another paper with a really super smart finance guy in our department who's done government portfolio analysis through business cycles. So he's looked at business cycles and how they've affected government revenue sources. And we're trying to call a similar thing for nonprofit portfolios. So nonprofits make their money in different ways. How have they changed during business cycles? And managing the data set. I don't know if anybody's ever worked with NCCS data in great detail. Luckily, we've had the most patient, diligent research assistant in the world who just happened to be there and available for us. Because, just getting certain things to harmonize and getting definitions and then finding out that NCCS is putting certain 990s in twice and all kinds of stuff like that. It's a huge mess, and it's nothing like the cleaner, more rigorous data sets that you can get in other areas. So. Oh.
Is that it?
Yeah,
All right.
I have a couple of comments. And
Oh, okay.
First of all, I found the presentation very intriguing, really fascinating. But two things. On the idea, let me hit you with a scenario, because this really is from the nonprofit world, it's quite real. A lot of the programs that we work with, started initially with, were fatherhood programs. Teaching guys to be responsible fathers, including guys who just, who are still in prison and have to come out and provide for their children. And we've been conscious of the fact that, there's a risk associated with any kind of work, and particularly when you're working with men and you're going to reunite them with children. If we were to take a risk assessment of that, there's a very good chance that it wouldn't be a good idea to invest in fatherhood programs, because how do you put a value on one father accidentally being reunited with his child and he rapes that child or kills that child? The fatherhood program, the field is very concerned about that, because it would only take one such instance for perhaps the entire idea of creating responsible fathers to collapse. So I appreciate the importance of risk. I do think it's very important, but we also have to look at the potentiality for gains in a greater light. With regard to the issue of monetizing the impact of social services, I get what you're saying about that too, but while we're sort of struggling to find out what's the best way to define it, we have 1.6 million nonprofits that have to stay alive. And the only way they can stay alive in a world that's now concerned about impact investing is to demonstrate a value that people understand. So, and then on the point about the issue of nonprofits and they fail and nobody knows, something else you gotta understand, I think everybody in this room can relate to this. When a nonprofit goes down, it's a very emotional thing. Most people start nonprofits out of emotional decisions. And the failure of one is very emotional. And so for them to publicize that would be akin to, you know, a man who wants to publicize on the internet that his wife left him. It's just not the kind of thing that they want to do. So for all of the valid reasons for everything that you said, there's some reasons that are based on the reality of the world of nonprofits that just have to counter against that in the interest of being able to provide the social services that we all need so much.
So I think your example is perfect, right? Because this is one of those things where you could go into a fatherhood program like you're talking about and not recognize all the risks and open yourself up to serious problems. But by doing a risk assessment, by looking at that, you can say, well, what's the probability of that happening and how can we decrease that probability? And so then you're motivated to put safeguards in place that will improve ultimately the public value of your program and protect you, which is so important.
Absolutely, and that's part of what we have a guy who specializes in risk assessment, and we help them do that in the interest of preserving their value creation. But it doesn't change the fact that if you did that kind of analysis that you were talking about, and you considered that there was a possibility that a dad could do this, the perceived negative impact of that could negate the whole idea of doing a program that is very much needed. And that's the part that scares me a little bit.
Right. And I love that at this conference we have practitioners and academics, because one of the other things you mentioned was, you know, we're on the ground. We don't have time to be thinking about, you know, new ways to value things that don't involve the dollar and then selling them to our funders, right? I mean, you don't have the time for that. But that's one of the cool things about my job, right? That's why we exist, is because we do have the time and we're not on the ground in the same way. And so if we can work together at conferences like this, right, we'll be able to push that forward and we can hear from you. Here are the problems. We're not able to put a value on, you know, a mom not hitting her kids when that's what she used to do or that sort of thing. And we can say, oh, what a cool problem. And we can go and we can work on it and bring it back to you and say, is this going to work? And you'll say, well, our funders would never, our funders would never buy that. So then we go work on that problem and come back. So I think this is a great conference.
Hurry up.
Well, and just a quick comment regarding failure. I wish that we treated nonprofit failures the way we treat fallen warriors. I mean, because that's really what they are, and that's the way we should culturally be thinking about them and treating them. I mean, the idea that you went and tried and failed, I mean, there's nobility in that I think we don't respect enough.
But it hurts.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Well, we're not the fallen warriors. That's fine. That's fine. Jeff?
So with fireization, we know that we're going to have losses. We have spent a lot of energy in tracking and quantifying what those losses have been and trying to build some kind of a sense of probability of that. And even, maybe a 10% number in terms of those loan losses. As we do our scaling work, you did a nice job of identifying the fact that there's a lot of motion around small numbers. Any resolution on how to get past best practices around getting past the emotion of dealing with the small, the emotion around the small losses and knowledge that it's going to happen.
So there was a study about individual investors versus institutional investors. Individual investors tend to exhibit what's called the gambler's fallacy. They chase losses and cut off gains early. But institutional investors don't do that. And the reason is because they have rules. They sort of acknowledge that these cognitive biases exist and they institute rules to compensate for them. And institutional, I just lost my mic. Oh, maybe that means we're done. Anyway, establish good rules and follow them. That's how institutional investors do it. So,
I think there was a question back here.
Please, I think it's kind of common policy on the fatherhood program. And one of the things we often fail to account for in the risk is, why does the organization exist in the first place? It is generally addressing societal risk. And if we fail to exist, that risk that we are worried about as an organization hurting our reputation or causing some harm would be even greater. So never forget that first box on the left, that first decision point, start the organization. What is the risk of inaction, not just the risk of action?
Bill Cleveland, and I want to thank you both for a great presentation. And I'm looking at, Aaron, you specifically mentioned that the retrospective view isn't necessarily very useful in prospectively anticipating what's going to happen. To me, that's the basis of forecasting models. And I just wondered what kind of, qualitatively, what sort of things would you look to put into a forecasting model as we collect data that then you would say, all right, we know this set of conditions came up, now we have an idea we can actually forecast what might happen, and if it's the weather, maybe tomorrow, or if it's social impact might happen at the conclusion of the program. I think long-term changes were a long way from doing that, because heck, we can't do the weather for next week.
Yeah, I think the failure of a retrospective approach isn't so much in patterns persist, and you need to find patterns, but to find patterns you need data. And I think that's where it all falls down. And I think that's what's so great about this conference, right, is that it enhances the ways we approach data and the ways we gather data. With the power and speed that's available now for gathering data, it's becoming, big data is this term that's becoming really popular nowadays. And for good reason, because it's giving us access to regression models that you never have access to before. And so I think we need to be more sophisticated in data collection, and then that's where forecasting becomes more useful. And we just don't have enough of it in the nonprofit side.
You asked about specific variables, and I would just suggest that you go to the logic model. I think the logic model is a beautiful tool for identifying for any given program what those factors might be, right? You look at your inputs, your activities, your outputs, and you can start to look at outcomes by predicting, using all of those things to build those models. And that's something that's very beautifully adaptable to any given program. And then it's not one size fits all. You might want to look at other things like, political and environmental and technological stuff as well, but really that logic model should incorporate those things if they're important to the program.
So one of the things I appreciated you taking a look at organizational capacity as well as the reputation and social engagement. Just as one point when people are, because a lot of people are doing consulting and working with nonprofits, in that part of organizational capacity, because I've been on the board work in terms of consulting and committee work, finance or program, it really doesn't matter. The part that people currently have blinders on when we're looking at organizational failure for nonprofits is they're not looking at their business continuation plan. So when I say, what if your executive director immediately left you? What if your building burned down? And a lot of groups, because they are so outcome oriented and looking at the good effect on the clients, they have to go back and do that portion so that if something, natural disaster or whatever, man-made or whatever, that if they're in the business to provide those services and those outcomes to their clients, that they've done that background work so they can pick up their organization, move it in an entirely different place, have a different way of communicating with their clients, whatever it might be. So that will help stem organizational failure if something, an X event happens. And also then they will continue to provide the mission base to the people that they have the emotional connection with their service.
Yeah, it reminds me of just a very quick story. I was advising some students who are going through our Social Venture Academy, and they were doing a really cool after-school program for at-risk youth, getting them into college, essentially. They piloted it for a year. Local high school sent a dozen kids to college, and they're in the growth process. And one of the students who was there kept on over and over using the phrase, well, the business side of this, and I had to beat it out of her. There is no business side. You are running a business. It just happens to have more than financial goals, but you're running a business. There are operational things that need to be ingrained into everything you're thinking about. So stop saying business side as though it's something you can separate, because that's not true. I mean, nonprofits have budgets, and they have staff, and they have everything that corporations have. And so to call it a business side pushes it aside as though it can be handled by the dirty business people who are willing to do that, and we'll be on the noble side where we're doing the service delivery that makes a difference. That's not how it works. So I appreciate you sharing that, because it's really true. We partition it, and And then when the business side fails, we don't connect and make sense out of why the social service side failed. So,
One more, and then we'll end.
You see, when you're talking about the failure, and one interesting, two things. One, non-profits would be, or you can say the social economy enterprises or social enterprises would be better served if they had an exit strategy.
yeah,
You know, you are not there for perpetuity
yeah.
to continue to do the same thing which you have been doing, because then you don't have a sense of what is the measure of success. Because, okay, if we are able to achieve these goals, then we are, you know, outliving our usefulness, or we have to exit this industry. It doesn't seem to be, every market has entry and exit, but here we don't have an exit strategy. And the other thing is, this measurement is always done ex ante best. You know, too many for-profit companies start measuring things after the fact to demonstrate value. And some of the most successful social enterprises, examples that I've seen, have embedded it into their blueprint of organizational design, measurement, right at the inception of the whole thing, rather than when the programs come in and then they scamper to measure themselves.
Yeah.
Great, thank you all. Great.